Hello, assalamu alaikum, namaste, sat sri akal. Hello, my name is Farheen Khan, and you're watching the Azeeza show. Last week, we had a chance to talk a little bit about the issue of homelessness as we were talking about policy and politics. Today, we're actually going to talk a little bit more about homelessness and the way that it affects women. So with me today are Michelle Bilek and Natalie Kaminski. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
That's great. So I really want to just jump right into it and talk about, last week, Michelle, you and I were talking a little bit about homelessness, and we sort of ran out of time and wanted to really talk about, lived experience and what that means. So maybe we can talk to both of you and just sort of, give us an idea of, the prevalence of homelessness, whether it be, locally or sort of nationwide. And let's start with that.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you start with the bigger picture.
Sure. Well, my work in the homelessness sector, it's really opened my eyes to the face of homelessness. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, I would have to say that the public view a homeless individual as usually being like a middle-aged man, someone with mental health issues and addictions issues usually as well. But in many circumstances, that's not the case. Throughout Canada, actually, we have a large homeless population of youth, women with children, veterans homelessness. And obviously also newcomers and the racialized community as well, which is a little bit, their needs are a little bit different than from the status quo. The face of homelessness is different in every community as well. It's not so visible in some of the suburbs, right? Mm-hmm. So we see a lot of people sleeping rough, some people, staying with family or friends, couch surfing, as well as sleeping in their car. So, the individual isn't necessarily on the streets per se, but they are homeless.
Homeless, yeah. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an important point is that we can't see it.
Mm-hmm.
So in the region of Peel, we currently don't have a shelter that's dedicated to just women. There is a shelter that's co-ed in Brampton or in Mississauga, but there's nothing in Brampton. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes when I'm working with someone that's homeless, they don't want to go to Mississauga because all their supports are in Brampton.
Right.
So they're sleeping in banks, staying in relationships that are abusive. Women that are involved in the sex trade are staying with clients, getting motel rooms, and then we're not capturing that data because those women aren't coming to get service. Mm-hmm. So when we look at our data, we don't see as many homeless women as we actually have.
Right.
And I think that's how the shelter system was built, was on data. Mm-hmm. So a whole hidden population of women is being lost and being underserved.
Right. Mm-hmm. So why, you mentioned the point, the issue of like abusive women, like women that are being abused, and sort of, that's the world that I come from in some ways in terms of the VAWs, the shelters, the women's shelters and stuff like that. So you're right, like there's women who are actually fleeing from home and coming in, and accessing service, but these are women that are hidden in the sense that they're not actually necessarily being abused in some situations, but they're actually homeless. Mm-hmm. Right? So what do you think is the root cause of all of this? Like, why is there such an issue around homelessness?
I think that poverty plays a huge role in it. Mm-hmm. Our housing market sucks. It's unaffordable even for people that are employed. Mm-hmm. And then you add on the stigma of, say, drug use or somebody that presents poorly because they've been homeless for a long time. Mm-hmm. And nobody wants to rent to them. You add OW, ODSP, nobody wants an OW or ODSP client renting from them. Right. The rates that people are getting on OW and ODSP is only enough to get a rooming house, which isn't a stable situation because the rooming houses are in bad condition.
Can you give us an example just for the audience to hear? Like, what is the amount of money that they would get on OW? On an average for a single person?
I believe the maximum's around $720.
Yeah.
Per month, right?
Yeah, and then $495 is allowed to go towards rent.
Yeah.
And that's just like ridiculous. How can you even afford anything, right?
For $495, you can't find a room.
Not
so people are using their whole check to pay for a rooming house.
Yeah. Right. And then that's where you start to see populations reaching out to like food banks and stuff to be able to supplement, right? Because your rent is basically all of what you have. There's really no money for food, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, do you want to maybe, Michelle, talk a little bit more about the poverty element on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Natalie. I think that society has to look at the systemic issues, which of course always track back to poverty, issues of poverty and unaffordability of living in the communities that they are. And then of course mental health. Both those are sort of hand in hand. I think trauma as well. It plays a large part in what causes people to be in situations where they are homeless. But certainly in the region of Peel, and actually pretty much throughout Ontario, like Natalie said, affordability of housing it's a big problem. It's a crisis, really. You know, and you have limited availability of rental units on top of the fact that you have sky high rental costs. It's impossible for a person who's on, you know, some sort of subsidy to be able to afford a place on their own. Impossible, absolutely impossible.
For sure.
Or pass a credit check.
Yeah.
Right? Even with our programs that we have, like the case management, housing first programs that we have, we're dealing with people that have been homeless for so long that have completely drained every access to finances that they've had available to them. And now we're trying to house them and people are asking for credit checks and everything may be in line, but their credit is off. And they can't get a place.
It's impossible.
I hear that. Yeah, that's
well, we know what it's like.
This, right? 100%.
Any person who's been trying to look for a rental apartment anywhere in the GTA comes to the same conclusion.
And the thing with the homelessness thing is that it's not something like that. I mean, it can impact anybody, right? It's not something like, you know, that only impacts certain segments of the population. I mean, Michelle and I know, like we have our own sort of lived experiences as well, and so do you, Natalie, right? Like when I ran in the federal election in 2015, like most people don't know, I had a great job. I left the job. I went to, run the campaign, and afterwards I was couch surfing for probably 6 months until I could afford to get another place, right? So like we all have our experiences of that. That's not to say that I wasn't doing well before, or I'm not in a place today, but like we all have ups and downs in life, right? And I think that's part of the whole discussion is like, how do you talk about these issues when people, it's so hard to kind of bring it out in the open, right?
Yeah, I think that we have a lot of working poor families in the region where if one person loses their job, the whole family is displaced.
Absolutely.
I mean, if I lost my job tomorrow, I don't know where I would live because everything's so expensive. Even working in the region, you need transportation to get around the region. So I think that makes our environment a little different than Toronto. They have a great transit system. Our transit system is a little broken up. It's a wider area.
For sure.
So people, even when they get employed, it's about being able to keep a job, to get to a job, to be able to pay the rent. And if everything doesn't align, then we end up with, the average Joe being homeless.
Yeah. And I think that women have also a unique experience as well, because most women usually do have children at some point in their life, right? So accessing affordable childcare is another huge issue, right? Sure. And I think that again, that because women have such a unique experience where they usually are having to also bring their children with them, it's very, very difficult for that woman, say in a violent situation, to leave her husband or leave her partner, because that for one, they don't know they don't know how to navigate the system. I mean, let's face it, the region of Peel, and quite frankly, even in Toronto, the system is very, very much broken. And then also taking that leap of faith, or the risk of losing leaving your home where you have some sense of stability. And taking your child with you is very, very daunting and scary for women. I can see why a lot of women decide that they'd rather stay in a violent situation than end up on the streets with their children.
For sure. The shelter system's scary, right? For somebody who is accessing it for the first time, they don't know what they're going into. They're calling shelters that are saying they don't have space. They're being told they have to leave the region in order to get a bed, or they're going to a co-ed shelter. They need to be separated from their children, or go to a different end of the city, and that's not realistic for somebody that is in a crisis in the moment, you're telling them to rearrange their whole life.
Yeah, no,
It's
for
a
sure.
huge risk. It's a huge risk.
Yeah, I mean, we've been, you know, dealing with lots of women as well in the community. We've seen their stories of how they're basically, you know, terrified of going into shelter because they just don't know what to expect, and it's hard. I mean, you can't, you know, to go into a communal space where you're already dealing with your own trauma with, you know, and then having little children as well, sort of alongside of you, and then trying to navigate a system that, you know, perhaps you're not familiar with, or, you know, in some cases that you don't speak the language. Like, there's so many other sort of pieces to that, right?
I think the flip side of that too is that women that are connected to services think their only option is the co-ed shelter that we have in Peel.
Right.
They don't realize that they do qualify to go into a VAW, Violence Against Women funded shelter, because they're a drug user or a sex worker, and they don't fall under the traditional idea of what the VAW shelters look like. And staff isn't prepared to have sex workers and drug users come in and disrupt families that are within the shelter. So then it's about supporting staff to also take on the task of supporting somebody who's a single woman coming from vulnerabilities of, you know, being beaten up or raped or whatever on the street. Women on the street go through some
let's talk about that just shortly. We're going to just take a quick break, and I want to get on to that. Okay, we'll just take a quick break and we'll be back. Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Azeeza Show. We have my guests here, Michelle Bilek and Natalie Kaminski, and we're just talking about the issue of homelessness and how it affects women. So Natalie, just before the break, you were talking about the issue of, you know, there are some cases where women that are homeless are actually, you know, using drugs, and, you know, or having addictions of some kind, right? In terms of, you know, so to tell us a little bit more about that. What does that mean?
So I think that when we're looking at women that are on the streets, that are unstable in where they're sleeping, where they're eating, where they're getting their clothes from, that are dealing with trauma and mental health issues, potentially people self-medicate, right? People do drugs because drugs make you feel good. Being homeless feels crappy. So it would be, it's a natural reaction to try to numb some of that stuff out. So we have women, some of the women I work with use substances. They use substances to survive. They use substances to medicate themselves. They use substances to feel better. They struggle accessing services because of the fact that being a substance user carries so much stigma. Even in today's age, when we're looking at like the opioid epidemic and the overdose crisis, we're hearing some really harsh language from the general public about people who use substances, like they've made the choice, let them die. So drug users accessing services, they have that fear about what they're going to encounter when they go into a shelter. I've worked with women that have gone into shelters that are active drug users or sex workers. And one of the biggest issues was other shelter residents not feeling safe around this person, even though this person wasn't using on site. And then staff not knowing how to calm other residents down.
I remember that.
And support
the shelters as well. That's true.
And then support the person that's at the shelter. So people go in, they run into those judgments, and not from staff, but from other clients that are there. And then they leave and they don't return. The shelter system has changed. Even from the time that I was in the shelter, they had a zero tolerance for drug use. Now, as an outreach worker, I go out to the shelters and provide harm reduction supplies. And I feel like the policies are starting to get better. But even if the policies change, we have to rebuild trust with the individuals that would be using the shelters. After years of running into that like oppressive stigma, like the system failing them, feeling judged, that the trust needs to be rebuilt. People need to start having good experiences and talking about them in order to get more people to come out to the shelters.
Yeah, it's a huge change. I mean, for our shelters as well as any service providers to function from a harm reduction perspective it's a necessity. It's a necessity.
So what is harm reduction? Can we talk about that just for our viewers?
So harm reduction is the concept of reducing the harm that somebody experiences in using substances. It's giving somebody agency over their own choices, and whether they want to stop or not stop, it doesn't matter. We're just there to support them. In the moment, it's extremely client-centered. So if somebody wants to stop using substances, we'd support them on that path. If somebody wants to continue substances, we'll provide them education on how to use safely. We'll provide them equipment to lower the risk of infectious diseases. And we'll support them in helping to navigate systems. So if somebody is an injection drug user, and they want to know about which methadone clinic is the best because they want to go on methadone because they don't like waking up dope sick. We'll help connect them to a methadone clinic. It's really meeting the client where they're at and providing them support.
And you work at FAN, so can you tell us a little bit about sort of what that is and what type of services you provide?
So I work at PL/HIV/AIDS Network. We have a bunch of different programs. So we have an LGBTQ program, we have an African Caribbean Black program, we have a women's specific program, and all of our roles are like community development to ensure that other agencies in the region have the capacity to do support work for individuals that are at risk of or are HIV positive. The harm reduction program provides harm reduction supports. We provide equipment. We're right now working on a drug strategy as well for the region of PL and engaging with drug users to participate in building that strategy with recommendations. We're part of a collaborative with REACH, which is a Housing First program, and we provide support, peer support for the sex workers and trans women that are going through that program and run a drop-in at John Howard once a week so that women can gather together and support each other. And through that drop-in, we did a sex worker needs assessment, and last year we had a march to demand safe space for women because one of our women was killed. So we do a whole lot of stuff.
Excellent work, much needed work, right?
Absolutely.
And it's the work that it's unforgiving work, and you know what, most community members have no idea that is going on.
Right?
Like, you know,
a lot of people, I'm sure, don't even know about.
Communities are in denial, right? That there's issues around sex trafficking, that there is issues around women who are homeless, who are sex workers, right, in the sex trade, and the fact that you know, harm reduction is still so stigmatized in our communities, right? So the work that FAN does is, I think, essential.
So question for you both then, like, you know, given that this is the case, I mean, I've, you know, also seen, I was doing a bit of trafficking work in terms of research in Halton, trying to put together like a strategy on how to support women that were coming out of the trafficking system. But, you know, my interest is really to say, you know, when I was doing some of the research as well, meeting some of the women and stuff, you know, it crosses all sort of, you know, racial sort of boundaries, right? Like, we're not talking, it's just one particular community that's affected by homelessness or, you know, trafficking and stuff like that. How do we talk to communities about this, right? Like, I really want to talk about that. Like, how do we, you know, yes, a lot of us might be in denial. Why would, you know, let's talk about two things. One, you know, how does a woman become homeless, right? We touched on it earlier, but like, let's really paint a picture of people, right? This isn't just people being like, oh, you know, I lost my job, therefore I'm, you know, now homeless, or, you know, there's young women that are having to leave home because of issues and then are you know, ending up on the streets. There's issues around, like, you know, kids that are with CAS and that are, you know, ending up on the streets. Like, what are some of the ways in which people end up on the streets, first of all? Let's talk about that.
Both of those, right? Both of those. Someone who's, you know, incarcerated and, you know, they get out of jail. Someone who's hospitalized to homelessness. It happens in many parts of our system.
Right.
And those people are frequently in a situation where they, there's no programs or services which help them through that, navigate the system to where they can actually find housing, right?
Yeah, but like, why are they incarcerated? Let's even talk about that, right? Like, that goes back to the issue of poverty often, right?
Yeah. So in sex work, there's this whole idea of like trafficking and sex work being the same thing, and it's not. And I think that when we talk about sex work, we're picturing like the victim always, and that's not always the case. And so when I was a sex worker, I used to say like, poverty's my pimp. Like, so if anybody needs to get arrested, it's the system, because they've put me in this position. So I would never like identify as a victim of anything. Like, I chose to work for establishments that weren't always the fairest, but I was poor. I didn't really have much choice. I had limited resources, and I think that that's a big issue in our region and in all other regions, is that our resources are thin. And then we have a new government coming in that's thinning out our resources even more. So I actually think that the next 4 years are going to be a lot harder for the below poverty line, above poverty line, anybody under like upper class is going to struggle in the next 4 years.
You certainly have to talk when you're speaking about these issues. You really have to talk about policy, and like kind of going back to what we discussed in the last time I was here. It's really about policy at the government level, right? So you have to have buy-in on these issues, right? And unfortunately, what goes hand in hand with buy-in is stats, right, and statistics. So you really have to put a lot of emphasis in breaking down the stigma, but also bringing in the statistics, the knowledge, the lived experience, all to change policy, right? Because if our levels of government are willing to fund programs and services to reduce, eliminate, eradicate poverty and homelessness, then it's never going to happen, right? And like Natalie said, by far, we will see systemic cuts across all sectors, specifically
the status
in
of
women.
Women Canada, the status of women Ontario has been cut, right? The entire ministry's
specifically
gone, right?
in the women,
the
women's
Ministry
sector.
of Immigration and Citizenship gone.
Yeah, exactly.
Today, the sex ed curriculum has been discontinued. So I think we're going on a horrible path. Funding to fix our schools has gone. I don't know where we'll be in 4 years.
And what's funny is that most of these programs and services are women-centric, right?
Yeah,
the women either work in that social service area, or their children are impacted, or they're impacted directly.
For sure.
Which is quite telling, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're both right. Like, we have to hold our politicians accountable and our governments accountable to ensure that those who actually need the services are getting access to those services, right? So I want to take an opportunity to thank you both for being on the show. We are just about to wrap up, and thank you again for being here, for sharing your experiences, for talking about this particular issue of homelessness and how it impacts women.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Take care.